In peaceful corners of rural Britain, acres of broken tarmac are the only evidence to today's generation that young men and women, just like them, once did something incredible here. Thousands joined RAF Bomber Command to help save Europe from the catastrophe of Nazi Germany. Their average age was just 22. Many were still teenagers. 55,000 of them flew missions over enemy territory and never returned. Today, these forgotten airfields serve as their only memorial. For despite their huge sacrifice, there is as yet no national memorial to Bomber Command. The aircrews were all volunteers and knew only too well the dangers they faced. Amongst them was Australian pilot Peter Swan, who in the early days of the war flew Blenheims.
In those days, the Blenheims were doing shipping strikes, which was a pretty dangerous enterprise because often half a dozen planes would go out and possibly 2 would come back. I seem to remember I met a squadron leader who went from pilot officer to squadron leader in 6 weeks, I think, because everybody superior to him was killed off in the process.
Pilot Charles Patterson was flying equally hazardous operations on his squadron.
I used to go and say goodbye to my dog and perhaps look at him and say, well, I may not be seeing you again, or probably won't. And then I used to say my prayers before I went, and pray on the assumption that whether I came back or not was up to the good Lord.
Throughout the war, casualties in Bomber Command were amongst the highest of any Allied fighting force. Aircrews could expect to survive just a few weeks. Those working on bomber stations in non-flying roles often had a particular insight into the losses each squadron endured. Having joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, 18-year-old Pip Beck found herself serving as a wireless operator on a bomber station.
It was a matter of life and death. And you would go back and you would go on duty and you would look at the ops board and you'd see that there were ops on tonight, and you would know that some of those people were not going to come back.
Pilot Peter Swan.
When we took off, the whole side of the aerodrome was absolutely covered with people cheering as we went down.
Flying in darkness gave the bombers some protection against fighters, but less against flak. Hampden pilot Robert Key.
The flak was always unpleasant, always gave one a nasty turn. Next thing I remembered was a shattering of everything. Total feeling of chaos. But I remember very strongly the feeling that the engine had no power.
The fire started around about the middle of the aeroplane.
Rear gunner Harry Jones.
There was all sorts of smoke and confusion, and by this time we'd lost a lot of height. And there were flames all around, and I thought, well, the best thing I can do is get to the front, through the hatch, and get out. But by that time the aeroplane was pretty badly smashed up. There were bits hanging off. I was hit in the back first, and it come across, and then through the ankle, and I rang up the skipper in the front and said, look, I've been hit, and it bloody well hurts. There's no doubt that Fred was dead. He'd been hit with a lot of bullets. I saw his body shuddering, and his colour went from green to grey, and oh yes, he was dead.
I remember finding we were in a spin. I remember thinking, this is it.
For every airman lost, there were family and friends left behind.
Well, the inevitable happened. That night he didn't come back. I remember standing on the watch office roof, staring out into the sky and thinking, you've got to come back. The aircraft has got to be there. It's got to come back. And I dissolved into floods of tears and ran off. I'd never lost anybody before. I didn't know what it was like. And it really was like having something torn out of me, I felt at the time.
Nearly every close friend I made in the war was written off. It seemed like a jinx, because you don't make more than 4 or 5, but as each one would go, and then I'd make great friends with 1 or 2 others. The ones one would laugh and always talk to in the mess or sit joking with in the crew room, they all went. But when they go at the time, there's this awful feeling of regret. But it's momentary, and you put it out of your mind. But it's since the war, and particularly now as I get much older, that I think of them much more, and it's now that the sadness comes over me. And the faces of my closest friends float across my mind.